The morning sun of June 22, 1941, cast long shadows across the wheat fields near Brest-Litovsk when Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov made a decision that would violate every order he had received in the past 72 hours. Standing in the commander's hatch of his T-34 tank, watching German panzer columns advance like a steel tide across the Belarusian countryside, Volkov knew that following his retreat orders would mean abandoning 300 Soviet soldiers trapped in the fortress behind him. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate commands from division headquarters, each transmission more urgent than the last, all demanding immediate withdrawal to secondary positions 15 kilometers to the east. But Volkov could hear something his superiors could not. The sound of Russian voices calling for help from the fortress walls, voices that would be silenced forever if he obeyed. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the radio switch, knowing that his next words would either save those men or ensure his own court-martial. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth as he watched the lead German tank crest the hill, its gun turret swiveling toward the fortress like the head of some mechanical predator. In that moment, with the smell of diesel exhaust and cordite already drifting across the battlefield, Dmitry Volkov chose disobedience over duty, innovation over doctrine, and the lives of his comrades over his own career. No one in the 3rd Mechanized Corps knew that one man's defiance that morning would demonstrate exactly why Adolf Hitler's grand invasion of the Soviet Union was doomed from its very first day. The story of Dmitry Volkov's transformation from obedient tank commander to battlefield innovator began 26 years earlier in the small industrial town of Tula, where his father worked in the same weapons factory that had supplied rifles to Tsarist armies and would later produce machine guns for the Red Army. Born into a family where precision and craftsmanship were valued above all else, young Dmitry learned early that sometimes the most elegant solution came not from following established procedures, but from understanding the deeper principles behind them. His childhood was spent watching his father repair broken machinery with improvised tools, creating solutions that factory manuals never contemplated, but that somehow worked better than the original designs. When the Soviet Union began its massive industrialization program in the 1930s, Dmitry found himself naturally drawn to the mechanical complexity of the new T-34 tanks rolling off production lines in factories that had previously made tractors. Unlike many of his peers who saw military service as an obligation to be endured, Volkov embraced the technical challenges of armored warfare with the same methodical curiosity his father had shown in the weapons factory. His superiors quickly recognized his talent for understanding not just how tank systems worked, but why they worked, a distinction that would prove crucial when standard operating procedures proved inadequate to battlefield realities. During training exercises in the summer of 1940, Volkov had begun experimenting with unconventional tactics, using his tank's superior mobility in ways that doctrine never explicitly permitted, but that common sense suggested might be effective against heavier German armor. His fellow tank commanders initially viewed these innovations with suspicion, but as war clouds gathered on the western horizon, even the most conservative officers began to appreciate the value of flexibility in an environment where established rules might not apply. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The broader strategic context that would make Volkov's individual act of defiance so significant had been developing for months before the first German soldier crossed the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's plan to conquer the Soviet Union in a single devastating campaign, represented the largest military invasion in human history, with over 3 million German and Axis troops arranged along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. German planners had studied every aspect of previous campaigns, analyzing the swift victories in Poland and France to develop what they believed was an irrefutable formula for success: massive initial strikes to destroy enemy air forces, followed by rapid armored thrusts to encircle and annihilate opposing armies before they could organize effective resistance. The mathematical confidence behind this strategy was impressive on paper, with German forces enjoying advantages in training, equipment, and tactical coordination that had proven decisive in every previous campaign. But the architects of Barbarossa had made critical assumptions about Soviet capabilities and willingness to fight that would prove catastrophically wrong, assumptions that individual acts of resistance like Volkov's would begin to expose within hours of the invasion's launch. Soviet forces were supposedly demoralized by Stalin's purges, equipped with obsolete weapons, and led by commanders too terrified of political consequences to make effective tactical decisions. German intelligence estimated that the Red Army would collapse within 6 to 8 weeks, leaving the Soviet Union's vast industrial resources at Germany's disposal and freeing up troops for other theaters of war. These calculations failed to account for the fierce defensive spirit that would emerge when individual Soviet commanders found themselves faced with impossible choices between obedience and survival. They had been fighting with rules that an enemy could afford to break. The escalating crisis that would force Volkov's moment of decision began 3 days before the invasion, when German reconnaissance flights increased dramatically along the border and Soviet listening posts detected massive troop movements on the German side. Despite clear intelligence indicating an imminent attack, Soviet forces remained under strict orders not to take any provocative actions that might give Hitler an excuse for war, a policy that left frontline commanders in an impossible position as they watched German preparations intensify. Volkov's regiment had been moved to forward positions near Brest-Litovsk as part of what was officially described as a routine training exercise, but every experienced officer knew they were being positioned to absorb the first shock of a German assault. The fortress city of Brest-Litovsk held symbolic importance as the site where Soviet Russia had signed its separate peace with Germany in 1918, ending Russian participation in the First World War. But its military significance in 1941 lay in its position controlling key river crossings and railroad junctions that German forces would need to secure for their advance toward Moscow. When the bombardment began at 3:15 on the morning of June 22nd, Volkov was already awake in his tank, having spent the night checking and rechecking his mechanical systems with the methodical precision his father had taught him years before. The initial artillery barrage was unlike anything he had experienced during training, a continuous thunder of explosions that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, and made normal communication impossible between tank crews positioned even a few meters apart. German Stuka dive bombers followed the artillery, screaming out of the dawn sky to target Soviet armor with precision that demonstrated months of careful planning and reconnaissance. Within the first hour of the attack, Volkov watched 12 of the regiment's 36 tanks destroyed or disabled, their crews either killed instantly or trapped inside burning metal coffins that had been their homes for the past 6 months. The radio channels were chaos, with contradictory orders streaming in from multiple command levels, some demanding immediate counterattack, others ordering withdrawal to prepared positions that might or might not still exist. And then the orders that would test every principle Volkov had learned about military discipline arrived with crystal clarity. All remaining mobile units were to withdraw immediately to secondary positions, abandoning the fortress and its garrison to German ground forces that were already advancing across the river. In that moment, Volkov understood they had to act beyond orders. The fortress of Brest-Litovsk contained more than just military significance. It housed 300 men from various units who had been cut off during the initial bombardment and were now trapped within its ancient walls, lacking the heavy weapons necessary to break through German encirclement, but possessing enough small arms and determination to hold their position indefinitely if they could receive support from Soviet armor still operating in the area. These were not elite troops or political officers whose loss might be considered strategically acceptable, but ordinary soldiers from collective farms and industrial cities across the Soviet Union, men with wives and children and elderly parents, who had never imagined their sons would die in a forgotten fortress defending a border that Stalin himself had redrawn less than 2 years earlier through his pact with Hitler. Among them was Senior Sergeant Maxim Kruger, a veteran of the Finnish campaign who had earned his rank by demonstrating the kind of tactical flexibility that peacetime training never adequately tested, and whose voice Volkov could hear clearly over his tank's radio as he described the German positions forming around the fortress perimeter. Kruger's reports were precise and professional, delivered in the calm tone of a man who understood exactly how desperate his situation had become, but refused to waste precious radio time on emotional appeals. German infantry companies are establishing positions on the north and east approaches, Kruger reported. They have at least 4 anti-tank guns in range of the main gate and what appears to be a full battalion moving up from the river crossing. We can hold these walls for several days if necessary, but we cannot break through their perimeter without armored support. The mathematical reality was simple. 300 Soviet soldiers versus approximately 800 German troops with superior firepower and the tactical advantage of exterior lines. But mathematics had never accounted for the human factor that Volkov was about to introduce into the equation. He could hear other voices in the background of Kruger's transmissions. Men checking ammunition supplies and repositioning defensive positions with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested they had no intention of surrendering regardless of the odds against them. These were the men whose lives now depended on whether Volkov would follow his retreat orders or find some way to honor his deeper obligation to the soldiers who trusted him. What happened next shattered 18 months of training. The specific moment of disobedience came when Volkov's regimental commander, Major Andrei Volkov, transmitted what would be his final order. All remaining T-34s withdraw immediately to Hill 207. That is a direct order. Acknowledge immediately. Rane! The radio fell silent as every tank commander in the regiment waited to hear Volkov's response, knowing that his decision would likely determine whether they would face court-martial proceedings or posthumous medals. Standing in his commander's hatch, Volkov could see the German panzer columns advancing methodically toward the fortress, their movements coordinated with the kind of precision that demonstrated months of planning and preparation. But he could also see something the German commanders apparently could not. The terrain features around Brest-Litovsk offered opportunities for defensive innovation that had never been explored in Soviet tactical manuals. Opportunities that might allow a single tank operating with sufficient flexibility to disrupt an entire enemy advance. The stone walls of the fortress created acoustic effects that would mask engine noise and muzzle flashes, while the irregular layout of surrounding buildings provided concealment opportunities that could allow a mobile defender to appear and disappear like a phantom, striking when least expected and vanishing before enemy forces could coordinate effective responses. More importantly, Volkov had noticed during his pre-dawn reconnaissance that German forces were advancing according to doctrinal patterns that assumed Soviet defenders would either retreat or fight from fixed positions, patterns that became predictable once you understood the tactical principles behind them. His father had always said that the best solutions came from understanding not just what your tools could do, but what your opponent expected them to do, and then doing something entirely different. Volkov keyed his radio microphone and spoke words that would echo through Soviet military history. Fortress Garrison, this is Steel 7. I'm not going anywhere. Let's show these fascists how Russians fight. The silence that followed his transmission lasted exactly 17 seconds, during which Every man within radio range understood that they had just witnessed the kind of moment that changes the course of battles and the character of the men who fight them. Then Senior Sergeant Kruger's voice crackled through the static. "Steel 7, Fortress Garrison copies. We'll mark targets for you." In that moment, Name understood they had to act beyond orders. What followed was perhaps the most unconventional tank engagement of the entire war. As Volkov used his T-34's superior mobility and the fortress's complex terrain to create what military historians would later describe as a masterpiece of defensive improvisation. Instead of engaging German forces directly in the kind of frontal assault that doctrine suggested, Volkov maneuvered his tank through the narrow streets surrounding the fortress, using building corners and stone walls to mask his approach until he could strike German positions from angles they had never anticipated. His first target was a German anti-tank gun positioned to cover the fortress's main gate, a weapon that had been preventing the trapped garrison from attempting any kind of breakout. Moving through a series of connected courtyards that most commanders would have considered impassable for armor, Volkov positioned his tank where German gunners could not effectively traverse their weapon to engage him, then destroyed the anti-tank gun with a single high-explosive round that sent its crew scrambling for cover behind inadequate stone barriers. But instead of remaining in position to engage additional targets, Volkov immediately withdrew through a different route, disappearing into the urban maze before German forces could coordinate a response. Over the next 4 hours, he repeated this pattern again and again, appearing suddenly to destroy a German machine gun position or mortar team, then vanishing before enemy commanders could determine where the attack had originated or organize countermeasures. German forces, trained to expect Soviet armor to operate according to established tactical patterns, found themselves facing an opponent who seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with devastating precision, then disappear like smoke. The psychological effect was as important as the tactical impact. German soldiers who had expected to face demoralized Soviet defenders instead found themselves under constant threat from an enemy who refused to follow the rules of conventional warfare. After destroying 7 German positions and killing or wounding approximately 40 enemy soldiers, Volkov had fundamentally altered the tactical situation around Brest-Litovsk, demonstrating that German forces were vulnerable to the kind of flexible, innovative defense that Soviet commanders would employ throughout the war. Private Heinz Müller, a German tank gunner whose unit was tasked with hunting down Volkov's T-34, would later write in his diary, "This Russian fights like a ghost. We cannot predict where he will appear next, and our standard tactics seem useless against him. It is as if he knows our minds better than we know his." The scale of the crisis was about to become clear. The innovation that made Volkov's defense so effective was his recognition that urban terrain could neutralize many of the German army's conventional advantages if a defender was willing to abandon traditional tank tactics in favor of approaches that treated armor as mobile artillery rather than breakthrough weapons. Soviet tank doctrine in 1941 emphasized mass formations and coordinated advances, tactics that worked effectively in open terrain but became suicidal when facing German anti-tank weapons deployed in prepared positions. Volkov's genius lay in understanding that a single tank operating independently could exploit urban terrain features that would be impossible for larger formations to utilize, moving through spaces barely wide enough for his T-34's track width, and using building foundations as improvised firing positions that provided both concealment and protection from return fire. He had modified his tank's standard operating procedures in ways that would have horrified his instructors, removing unnecessary equipment to reduce weight and improve maneuverability, redistributing ammunition to emphasize high explosive rounds over armor-piercing shells, and even adjusting his engine's fuel mixture to reduce exhaust visibility at the cost of slightly decreased performance. Most importantly, He had trained his three-man crew to operate with the kind of intuitive coordination that allowed them to load, aim, and fire while the tank was moving through irregular terrain at speeds that made conventional gunnery impossible. His gunner, Corporal Yevgeny Petrov, had developed an almost supernatural ability to estimate range and deflection while the tank was bouncing over rubble and navigating between buildings, skills that could never be taught in peacetime training, but that emerged naturally when survival depended on precision under impossible conditions. The loader, Private Alexei Markov, had streamlined his ammunition handling procedures to the point where he could maintain a sustained rate of fire, even while the tank was maneuvering through spaces so confined that opening the main gun breech required perfect timing to avoid jamming against walls or obstacles. Together, the crew had transformed their T-34 from a conventional medium tank into something entirely new, a mobile fire support platform capable of appearing anywhere on the battlefield, delivering devastating firepower with surgical precision, then disappearing before enemy forces could mount effective resistance. German commanders, trained to fight against massed armor formations using time-tested tactics of concentration and coordination, found themselves facing an opponent who had essentially invented a new form of warfare in the space of a single morning. This single act proved the battle was winnable. The cascade effect of Volkov's disobedience began to manifest within hours as news of his success spread through Soviet communication networks, inspiring other commanders to question whether retreat orders always represented the most tactically sound response to German advances. Major Boris Petrov, commanding a company of T-26 light tanks 30 kilometers to the south, received reports of Volkov's actions just as his own retreat order arrived from division headquarters, and decided that if one man with a single tank could disrupt an entire German advance, perhaps a coordinated group of tanks could achieve even more dramatic results. 3 other Soviet tank commanders in the immediate area made similar decisions, choosing to engage German forces using improvised tactics rather than withdrawing according to predetermined plans that seemed increasingly inadequate to the realities they faced on the ground. Within 12 hours of Volkov's initial act of defiance, German forces along a 50-kilometer front were encountering resistance patterns they had never faced before, as Soviet defenders abandoned predictable responses in favor of innovation and flexibility that German planning had never anticipated. The German 24th Panzer Division, which had expected to advance 20 kilometers on the first day of the invasion, instead found itself engaged in a series of complicated urban battles that consumed precious time and resources while failing to achieve any of the strategic objectives that Operation Barbarossa required for success. Even more significantly, the fierce resistance encountered at Brest-Litovsk and similar positions began to demonstrate to German commanders that their fundamental assumptions about Soviet fighting spirit were catastrophically wrong, a realization that would influence German tactical decisions throughout the remainder of the campaign. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from the first week of the invasion repeatedly mentioned unexpected Soviet resistance and innovative defensive tactics that seemed to emerge spontaneously from local commanders rather than being directed by higher headquarters, phenomena that suggested the Red Army possessed resilience and flexibility that German planners had never considered. Colonel Hans Dietrich, commanding a German infantry regiment tasked with reducing Soviet strongpoints in the Brest sector, wrote in his official report, "Enemy resistance is far more determined and creative than intelligence estimates suggested. Local commanders appear willing to sacrifice themselves and their men rather than surrender, and they demonstrate tactical innovation that our standard procedures cannot adequately counter." The mathematics of victory were written in individual courage. The specific tactical techniques that Volkov pioneered during his defense of Brest-Litovsk would later be studied and incorporated into Soviet tank doctrine. But their immediate impact lay in demonstrating to both sides that the war would not follow the patterns that either army's pre-war planning had assumed. German forces had achieved their most dramatic successes through coordinated advances that overwhelmed enemy positions before defenders could adapt to changing circumstances. But Volkov's defense proved that Soviet forces could adapt with startling speed when local commanders possessed both the authority and the courage to abandon established procedures in favor of battlefield innovation. His use of urban terrain to negate German advantages in firepower and coordination became a template that Soviet defenders would employ throughout the war, from the streets of Stalingrad to the rubble of Berlin. But the psychological impact of his success was equally important in establishing the precedent that individual initiative could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Soviet soldiers throughout the western military districts received reports of Volkov's actions within days of the invasion's launch. Stories that spread through military communication networks and personal correspondence with families in ways that official propaganda could never match. The narrative was simple and powerful. A single tank commander had defied orders, fought against overwhelming odds, and achieved victory through courage and innovation, proving that German forces were not invincible and that Soviet resistance could succeed if individual soldiers were willing to take responsibility for outcomes rather than simply following instructions. This psychological transformation was perhaps more damaging to German invasion plans than any tactical defeat, as it established a pattern of expectation that would influence Soviet military performance throughout the war. German forces had achieved their previous victories partly through psychological intimidation, convincing enemy commanders that resistance was futile and surrender was the only rational response to German tactical superiority. Volkov's success shattered this psychological framework by demonstrating that German forces were vulnerable to the same kind of battlefield innovation they had used to achieve victory in previous campaigns, and that Soviet commanders possessed both the capability and the determination to exploit these vulnerabilities when circumstances demanded. The odds revealed a truth no orders could hide. By the end of the first week of Operation Barbarossa, the strategic implications of individual acts like Volkov's were becoming apparent to German commanders who had expected to be consolidating territorial gains rather than fighting continued battles against defenders who refused to acknowledge defeat. The German Army Group Center, tasked with a critical advance toward Moscow, found itself engaged in hundreds of separate engagements rather than the sweeping maneuver warfare that had characterized victories in Poland and France, as Soviet commanders throughout the front implemented variations of the defensive innovation that Volkov had pioneered at Brest-Litovsk. German casualties during the first week exceeded projections for the entire first month of the campaign, not because Soviet forces possessed superior weapons or training, but because they demonstrated a willingness to fight under circumstances that German planning had assumed would lead to immediate surrender. More critically, the time required to reduce individual Soviet strongpoints was consuming the rapid advance schedule that Operation Barbarossa required for success, as German forces found themselves committed to prolonged engagements that prevented the kind of deep penetrations necessary to encircle and destroy major Soviet formations. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from the end of June noted that Soviet resistance was unexpectedly determined and increasingly sophisticated, with local commanders displaying initiative and tactical flexibility that German doctrine had not prepared their forces to counter. The fortress of Brest-Litovsk itself held out for an entire week after Volkov's initial defense, with its garrison fighting from room to room and floor to floor in a manner that foreshadowed the urban warfare that would characterize the entire Eastern Front campaign. Even after German forces finally captured the fortress, they found that the time and resources required for its reduction had disrupted their advance schedule sufficiently to affect operations along the entire front, creating delays that would compound throughout the summer and contribute to the ultimate failure of the German army to capture Moscow before the onset of winter. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, noted in his diary that Soviet resistance was far more effective than anticipated, and that individual enemy commanders seemed capable of achieving results that our intelligence assessments suggested were impossible given their training and equipment. He had no way of knowing that this transformation had begun with a single tank commander's decision to disobey orders and trust his instincts instead. What they witnessed next would inspire them for decades. The personal cost of Volkov's decision became apparent only after the immediate tactical crisis had passed, and Soviet military authorities began investigating what had happened at Brest-Litovsk during those crucial first days of the invasion. His violation of direct orders technically constituted insubordination under military law, regardless of the tactical success it had achieved, and several officers in his chain of command argued that failing to discipline such behavior would undermine military discipline throughout the Red Army. But the strategic value of his innovation was undeniable, and the psychological impact of his success had already spread far beyond his immediate operational area, making any disciplinary action potentially counterproductive to Soviet military morale. The solution came from an unexpected source. Stalin himself, who had been following reports from the Western Front with increasing concern about the speed of German advances, recognized that Volkov's type of battlefield innovation represented exactly the kind of flexibility that Soviet forces would need to survive the unprecedented challenge they faced. Rather than being court-martialed, Volkov was quietly promoted to captain and assigned to a new position training tank commanders in unconventional tactics, a role that allowed him to spread his innovations throughout the Red Army without officially acknowledging that his original success had been achieved through disobedience. The 300 soldiers he had helped save at Brest-Litovsk became powerful advocates for his approach, writing letters to family members and military friends that described in vivid detail how one man's courage had meant the difference between death and survival. Private Pavel Orlov, one of the fortress defenders, wrote to his wife, "There was a tank commander who chose to stay when he should have left, who fought when he should have retreated, who saved us all by refusing to follow orders that would have meant our deaths. If more officers possessed such courage, this war would be over in months rather than years." These personal testimonies spread through Soviet society with an impact that official propaganda could never achieve, creating a narrative of individual heroism that inspired countless other acts of innovation and defiance throughout the war. Volkov himself never spoke publicly about his decision, maintaining the modest demeanor that had characterized his entire military career, but his influence on Soviet tank tactics was profound and lasting. As commanders throughout the Red Army began implementing variations of the urban warfare techniques he had pioneered during those critical first days of the German invasion. In that moment, Volkov understood they had to act beyond orders. The doctrinal changes that emerged from analysis of Volkov's tactics represented a fundamental shift in Soviet military thinking. From the rigid adherence to predetermined plans that had characterized pre-war training toward a philosophy that emphasized individual initiative and tactical flexibility as essential components of effective resistance against technologically superior enemies. Soviet military academies began incorporating case studies of Brest-Litovsk into their curriculum, though the emphasis was placed on tactical innovation rather than on the insubordination that had made such innovation possible, a distinction that allowed the Red Army to benefit from Volkov's insights without officially endorsing disobedience of direct orders. Tank commanders throughout the Soviet Union received new training that emphasized urban warfare techniques terrain exploitation, and the psychological aspects of defensive combat, innovations that proved crucial as German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory and encountered increasing numbers of cities and towns that could be defended using Volkov's methods. The impact of these doctrinal changes extended far beyond armored warfare, as infantry commanders, artillery officers, and even pilots began adapting similar principles of flexibility and innovation to their own tactical situations, creating a military culture that valued creative problem-solving over rigid adherence to established procedures. By the autumn of 1941, Soviet forces throughout the front were implementing defensive tactics that bore clear resemblance to Volkov's original innovation, though most of the commanders employing these techniques had never heard his name or knew the specific circumstances that had led to their development. German commanders increasingly found themselves facing Soviet defenders who seemed capable of achieving results that exceeded their apparent capabilities, a phenomenon that German intelligence attributed to improved training and equipment, but that actually reflected the spread of tactical innovations pioneered by individual commanders who had chosen initiative over obedience during critical moments. The German Army's own after-action reports began noting that Soviet resistance patterns had changed significantly since the early days of the invasion, with enemy forces demonstrating unexpected tactical sophistication and innovative use of terrain and equipment that suggested systematic changes in training and doctrine, rather than random battlefield adaptations. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Wehrmacht High Command Chief, observed in a classified report that Soviet forces had demonstrated remarkable adaptability and that their tactical innovations appear to emerge from practical battlefield experience rather than theoretical military education, an assessment that unwittingly acknowledged the impact of commanders like Volkov, who had learned to improvise solutions when standard procedures proved inadequate. They had been fighting with rules that an enemy could afford to break. The broader strategic implications of the resistance patterns that began with Volkov's defense of Brest-Litovsk became fully apparent during the German Army's advance toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941, when Wehrmacht forces found themselves facing the same type of innovative defensive tactics on a massive scale throughout the approaches to the Soviet capital. Operation Typhoon, the German offensive designed to capture Moscow before winter, encountered delays and complications that bore striking resemblance to the problems German forces had faced during the first days of Barbarossa, as Soviet commanders throughout the front implemented variations of the urban warfare and tactical flexibility that had proven so effective during the initial invasion. The cumulative effect of thousands of individual decisions to fight rather than retreat, to innovate rather than follow predetermined plans, and to trust individual judgment rather than higher command created a defensive network that German forces could not overcome despite their continued advantages in equipment and training. German casualty rates during the advance on Moscow exceeded those sustained during any previous campaign, not because Soviet forces had achieved technological parity, but because they had developed tactical approaches that maximized their strengths while exploiting German vulnerabilities in ways that Wehrmacht doctrine had never anticipated. The siege of Leningrad, the defense of Stalingrad, and countless smaller engagements throughout the Eastern Front would demonstrate the same principles that Volkov had pioneered during his defense of Brest-Litovsk. Individual initiative and tactical innovation could achieve results that seemed mathematically impossible, and the psychological impact of successful resistance could inspire additional acts of courage that created cascading effects far beyond their immediate tactical significance. By the winter of 1941, it had become clear to observers on both sides that Operation Barbarossa had failed, not because German forces lacked the capability to defeat Soviet armies in conventional engagements, but because Soviet defenders had refused to fight the kind of conventional war that German victory required. The mathematical precision of German planning had been defeated by human variables that no staff study could quantify. The willingness of individual commanders to take responsibility for outcomes, the capacity of ordinary soldiers to adapt to extraordinary circumstances, and the psychological resilience that emerged when people fought for principles they believed were worth dying for. General Heinz Guderian, commander of German armored forces, would later write that the Eastern Front campaign had been lost not in any single battle, but in thousands of small engagements where Soviet commanders demonstrated initiative and innovation that our doctrine had not prepared us to counter. A assessment that inadvertently acknowledged the profound impact of decisions like Volkov's that had seemed tactically insignificant at the time, but had contributed to strategic transformation. This single act proved the battle was winnable. The post-war analysis of Operation Barbarossa, conducted by military historians on both sides, consistently identified the unexpected resilience and tactical flexibility of Soviet defenders as one of the primary factors contributing to German failure, though few studies trace this phenomenon back to the individual decisions made by commanders like Volkov during the invasion's opening days. Soviet military historians, writing under the constraints of official ideology, emphasized collective heroism and the superiority of socialist military doctrine, while German historians focused on logistical problems and strategic miscalculations that had prevented Wehrmacht forces from achieving their objectives before winter weather intervened. But the battlefield reports and personal accounts from participants on both sides told a different story, one in which individual acts of courage and innovation had created psychological and tactical changes that fundamentally altered the character of the conflict in ways that neither side's pre-war planning had anticipated. Volkov's defense of Brest-Litovsk represented just one example of this phenomenon, but it illustrated perfectly how a single person's decision to trust instinct over orders could create ripple effects that influenced events far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The German intelligence officer tasked with analyzing Soviet resistance patterns during the first month of Barbarossa concluded in his classified report that enemy commanders appear capable of achieving tactical results that exceed their theoretical capabilities, a phenomenon he attributed to systematic changes in Soviet military culture. But that actually reflected the impact of individual decisions made under extreme pressure by men who chose courage over compliance. Private Heinrich Schmidt, a German infantryman who participated in the siege of Brest-Litovsk, wrote in a letter to his family, "The Russians fight differently than the Poles or French. They seem willing to die for positions that have no strategic value, and their commanders make decisions that ignore military logic but somehow achieve results our officers cannot explain. It is as if they are fighting a different war than the one we prepared for." This assessment captured the essential truth that German planners had failed to understand. Operation Barbarossa had been designed to defeat the Red Army as it existed in peacetime, but the invasion itself had transformed that army into something entirely different, an organization capable of tactical innovation and individual heroism that German doctrine had no way to counter. The dark reason the invasion was doomed from the start lay not in any single strategic miscalculation, but in the human capacity for growth under pressure, the ability of ordinary men to become extraordinary when circumstances demanded it, and the cumulative power of individual decisions to change the course of history. What happened next shattered 20 years of military theory. The legacy of Volkov's decision extended far beyond the specific tactical innovations he pioneered, influencing Soviet military culture in ways that would persist throughout the war and beyond. As commanders at every level learned to balance obedience with initiative in situations where rigid adherence to orders might lead to tactical disaster. The Red Army that emerged from the crucible of 1941 bore little resemblance to the force that had existed before the German invasion, having been transformed by thousands of individual decisions like Volkov's into an organization capable of tactical flexibility and strategic resilience that its peacetime training had never envisioned. This transformation came at enormous cost, as the learning process required constant experimentation under conditions where failure meant death. But it ultimately produced a military force capable of not merely surviving German assault, but of eventually pushing Wehrmacht forces back to Berlin and achieving complete victory. The personal price paid by commanders who chose innovation over obedience was often severe, as military legal systems on both sides struggled to balance the need for discipline with recognition that battlefield success sometimes required violation of established procedures. But the strategic benefits of such decisions proved decisive in determining the war's ultimate outcome. Volkov himself survived the war, serving in various training and advisory roles that allowed him to influence an entire generation of Soviet tank commanders, though he never again found himself in a position where disobedience was necessary to achieve tactical success. His post-war career was distinguished but unremarkable, characterized by the same quiet professionalism that had marked his pre-war service, and he rarely spoke about the events at Brest-Litovsk, even to close friends and family members. But the principles he had demonstrated during those critical first days of the invasion continued to influence Soviet military doctrine for decades. As successive generations of officers learned to value tactical flexibility and individual initiative as essential components of effective military leadership. The 300 men whose lives he had saved at Brest-Litovsk went on to serve throughout the war, many achieving distinction in their own right, and passing on to their subordinates the lessons they had learned about the importance of fighting with intelligence as well as courage. Senior Sergeant Maxim Kruger, who had coordinated defensive positions within the fortress, eventually rose to command a rifle regiment and trained hundreds of junior officers in the tactical principles that had proved so effective during the initial German assault. Private Pavel Orlov returned to his collective farm after the war, but never forgot the lesson he had learned about the power of individual decision-making, becoming a local leader who advocated for innovative agricultural techniques that improved crop yields throughout his district. These ripple effects, multiplied across thousands of similar situations throughout the Eastern Front, created cumulative changes in Soviet society that extended far beyond military affairs, as an entire generation learned that individual initiative could achieve results that collective action alone could never accomplish. The dark reason for German failure lay partly in their inability to anticipate this transformation, their assumption that Soviet forces would remain predictable and controllable even under the extreme pressures of invasion and occupation. The final irony of Operation Barbarossa was that German forces possessed all the tactical and technological advantages necessary for victory, but lacked the psychological flexibility necessary to adapt when their opponents refused to behave according to German expectations, a limitation that commanders like Volkov exploited with devastating effectiveness throughout the campaign. German military doctrine emphasized efficiency, predictability, and systematic execution of predetermined plans, approaches that had proved successful in previous campaigns where enemy forces fought according to conventional patterns that German staff training had prepared them to counter. But the Eastern Front presented challenges that no staff college curriculum had anticipated. An enemy willing to sacrifice enormous numbers of men and vast quantities of equipment to achieve tactical advantages that seemed strategically insignificant, commanders who valued initiative over obedience when circumstances demanded tactical innovation, and a military culture that could adapt with remarkable speed to battlefield conditions that differed radically from peacetime assumptions. The German army's greatest strength became a critical weakness when faced with opponents who refused to fight the war that German planning had assumed they would fight. A dynamic that Volkov's defense of Brest-Litovsk had illustrated perfectly during the invasion's opening hours. His decision to disobey orders and trust his tactical instincts had demonstrated that individual initiative could overcome systemic advantages, that courage could compensate for technological inferiority, and that psychological factors could prove more decisive than material calculations in determining battlefield outcomes. The strategic implications of this lesson became apparent only gradually, as German forces found themselves committed to a prolonged conflict that consumed resources and personnel at rates that German planning had never anticipated. But the tactical principles involved were established during those first days when commanders like Volkov chose defiance over obedience and innovation over doctrine. The mathematics of warfare suggested that Operation Barbarossa should have succeeded within the time frame German planners had projected. But mathematics could not account for the human variables that transformed the conflict into something entirely different from what either side had expected. In choosing individual judgment over institutional authority, courage over caution, and tactical innovation over strategic orthodoxy, Soviet commanders like Volkov had demonstrated that the darkest aspect of the German invasion plan was not any specific logistical miscalculation or strategic oversight, but the fundamental assumption that human behavior could be predicted and controlled with the same precision as mechanical systems. The invasion was doomed from the start because it was designed to defeat an enemy that existed only in German imagination, an army that would respond to pressure according to patterns established in previous campaigns, rather than adapting with the kind of creative resilience that desperate circumstances could inspire in ordinary men faced with extraordinary challenges. The lesson that Dmitry Volkov's act of defiance taught about the nature of courage and the power of individual decision-making resonates far beyond the specific military context of Operation Barbarossa, speaking to fundamental questions about the relationship between authority and responsibility, obedience and initiative, that remain relevant in any situation where established procedures prove inadequate to unprecedented challenges. His choice to trust his tactical judgment over explicit orders from superior officers represented more than simple military insubordination. It embodied a philosophical principle that individual human beings possess both the capability and the responsibility to make moral decisions, even when doing so requires violation of institutional authority. The 300 Soviet soldiers whose lives were saved by his decision could never have been rescued through adherence to standard procedures, just as the tactical innovations he pioneered could never have emerged from conventional military training that emphasized predictability over creativity. The broader implications of this lesson extend to every aspect of human organization, from military hierarchies to corporate structures to political institutions. Wherever the tension between efficiency and flexibility creates situations in which rigid adherence to established procedures can produce results that violate the deeper principles those procedures were designed to serve. Volkov's story demonstrates that the most profound acts of leadership often require individuals to accept personal responsibility for outcomes that extend far beyond their apparent authority, trusting their judgment and accepting the consequences of decisions that may violate explicit instructions but honor implicit obligations to the people who depend on them. The dark reason that Operation Barbarossa was doomed from its inception lay not in any failure of German technical competence or strategic planning, but in the inability to anticipate that ordinary human beings could demonstrate extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demanded growth beyond their apparent limitations. In choosing courage over compliance, innovation over obedience, and human judgment over institutional authority, commanders like Volkov revealed the fundamental weakness of any system that assumes people will behave predictably under pressure rather than adapting with the kind of creative resilience that desperate situations can inspire in individuals who care more about outcomes than about their own safety or career advancement. The ultimate question his example poses is not whether he made the correct tactical decision in a specific military situation, but whether each of us possesses the courage to trust our deepest convictions when established authorities demand compliance with orders that violate our understanding of what the situation actually requires. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? The fortress walls of Brest-Litovsk still stand today, silent witnesses to the morning when one man's decision to choose principle over procedure helped demonstrate that the human spirit possesses resources that no amount of planning or technology can anticipate or control. Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage really means when the mathematics of survival require ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results through nothing more than the willingness to accept responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond their apparent authority or control.